Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. As always, I'm your host Martin, and I'm very happy to have you with me today for my first new episode since being out for the past 3 weeks. So since I've been out and had released all of those last 3 episodes and recorded all of them before I went away on vacation, I've got a lot of announcements and thank yous and comments to make before we get into today's interview, which is with Tina Cat Courtney from plantmedicinepeople.com and Afterlife Coach. We had a great conversation actually almost 2 months ago now, and I'm happy to release the interview with Kat on the podcast today, but we've got a little bit of catching up to do before we get to our conversation. So please just bear with me as I rattle through some thanks and announcements and things like that. All right. First off, I just want to say, had a really excellent vacation. We had a family road trip up to the Pacific Northwest and spent a lot of time exploring the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. And just wanted to say, if you're curious and would like to see any of the many photographs I took of just beautiful Pacific Northwest coast landscapes and trees and forests and lakes and rivers and all of that, just stop by my Facebook page at Martin W. Ball on Facebook, and there's lots of photographs there. Some of you may know that I'm a pretty avid photographer and love doing nature photography, and man, it was great. It was really, really awesome. Just super beautiful. A great time. Really happy to have had that opportunity. But while I was gone, a lot happened. So I've got a lot of people to thank. And that's a really great thing. First of all, I want to thank Sammy, Carl, Coleman, and Craig, who have all joined up as new supporters over at my Patreon page. So they are brand new patrons for me. Of course, my Patreon page is patreon.com/MartinWBall. And I've actually reached a very personally exciting milestone for myself at my Patreon page. I created my Patreon page just a little over 2 years ago, and part of the inspiration for creating the Patreon page is that due to budget cutbacks from lower student enrollment as a result of coronavirus, I got laid off from my teaching position at Southern Oregon University. And it wasn't that was a big moneymaker for me, but it was about 1/3 of my monthly income. So one of the goals that I put out in creating the Patreon page, because you can list different goals of like, this is what I'm looking to make and this is why, or whatever. Here's my personal milestone. One of my personal milestones was to make a monthly income from Patreon that would match or compensate for my loss of income at Southern Oregon University. And this month, September 2022, is the first month since putting out my Patreon page a little over 2 years ago that my patrons are supporting me at a level that's pretty much equivalent to what I made at SOU on a monthly basis. So yay, thank you to all of my patrons, everybody who's active there now, also everyone who has been there and then had to leave for whatever reason or change their support level, because of course that happens. And so it's just very personally gratifying to have actually reached that goal and to have that loss of income now made up for through patronage at Patreon. So thank you all so much. Of course, if you'd like to support me over at Patreon, there's a variety of levels from $1 a month all the way up to $100, which gets you 1 hour check-in and consultation with me every month through video call, and different levels in between with different gifts and prizes, and prizes isn't really the right word, but anyway, things with my art on it get sent to you. So thank you, everyone over there at Patreon. It is so deeply appreciated, and it's nice to have your support and support of this podcast as well as the other work that I do. So thank you so much, all of you, and to those new patrons of Sammy, Carl, Coleman, and Craig. Also, some wonderful PayPal donations came in over the past few weeks, so I would like to thank those people. Wes, who makes a monthly contribution via PayPal and also is a supporter over at Patreon. Nicole, Cindy, Peter and Brooke, who also makes a regular monthly small contribution in support of the podcast. Thank you all so much. And a really unexpected and very generous new monthly donation made by James. And honestly, it's so generous that I'm kind of wondering, like, wow, is that real? But thank you, James. Amazing. Wow. Let's see. Also, I want to thank Sam, who reached out and wanted to get some digital copies of my artwork and send a little payment for that. And thank you so much, Sam, for your interest in my art and reaching out to actually make a purchase, because mostly I just post art for free online, and it's awesome. Happens very rarely, but thank you so much, Sam. Let's see. Of course, I'm back in quote unquote the office. I'm available for 30, 60, and 90-minute consultations to help you navigate and integrate your entheogenic experience. So feel free to reach out if that's something that you're feeling in need of. Just stop by at non-dual-entheogenicintegration.com. We've got details there. Coming up on the podcast, just to let you know about what's in the works. I have interviews already recorded with authors Sean Manceau and Cliff Dunning. Also have a very interesting interview from a company in Australia called Enosis, and they're developing virtual reality content and programs to work with psychedelic therapy. And we had a really interesting conversation the other day. So all that's going to be coming out on the podcast in the coming weeks, of course, with continued selections from the audiobook to the Entheological Paradigm 2021 edition. So that's what's going on here on the podcast as the summer kind of wraps up, and my son Jaden's going to be going back to school and all of that. So I don't know where you are in your lives, but you're probably making some transitions as well right now. And so that's where we're at. Again, it was a great vacation. It's great to be back, and looking forward to diving into consultations, which I've already had many of since I've gotten back, because there's a little bit of a backlog. And of course, there's going to be more great interviews to come here on the podcast. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for your support. Of course, you can stop by my personal webpage at martinball.net, use the PayPal link or the Patreon link at the top right of the page if you'd like to become a supporter of this podcast. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and get into our conversation with Tina Kat Courtney from plantmedicinepeople.com and Afterlife Coach. Here we go. Well, then, I'm going to go ahead and welcome Tina Kat Courtney onto the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. My guest, Kat, she works with, I think, the CEO and founder of Plant Medicine People, and I've got your website up here. I guess we're going to talk a little bit about Costa Rica, and also you do afterlife coaching sessions. And so I've got that website up. So you've got a few different things going on here. And one of the things that I love about doing this podcast is not only bringing interesting information to the listeners, tripping over myself this morning, but also getting the opportunity to meet interesting people such as yourself. So where I like to start is kind of invite you to introduce yourself and kind of tell us a little bit of your story of how you got into the world of psychedelic medicines, and then we'll get into all the details about Plant Medicine People and afterlife coaching and all of that. But let's hear your story first, if you wouldn't mind.
My story in a nutshell, it was almost 20 years ago that this cute boy I was dating in California said, "Do you want to go to the jungle and drink ayahuasca?" And I didn't know what that was, but I'd been a lifelong psychonaut at that point, was up for an adventure. So we ended up going, and it was one of those like pivotal, life-changing moments. Like discovering ayahuasca was like the missing puzzle piece I felt like I had been seeking for so long, in terms of trying to discover the reason why I was really quite wounded at the time, bulimic, functioning alcoholic, working with recreational drugs, but not in any sort of sacred ceremonial way, trying to have the non-dual ego death experience, but it was really coming from a place of like self-abuse rather than like true curiosity of wanting to know the universe in that way. So ayahuasca was my game changer, basically. And I went back and forth to the jungle for several years, but somewhere along the way, I was like, I wonder if a white girl from Montana can pour medicine. Is that possible? Because everybody I'd worked with was like indigenous at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out it was possible. You know, back then it wasn't the thing. There weren't circles in every Brooklyn like warehouse at that time. So I had to really kiss some frogs and find like my space in finding a teacher that spoke my language literally, you know, not just English, but consciousness, and also was willing to teach me the tradition of working with ayahuasca in the Shipibo Kanibo way, which is super ancient. So that happened. It was a 10-year apprenticeship. And once that was complete, I started pouring medicine and like helping people not only in the ceremony space, but in the integration, because obviously that's where the work really happens. And I launched Afterland Coaching a good 10 years ago before integration was a thing too. It was just something that was naturally happening. And I guess it's been 6 or 7 years now. My life has been completely dedicated to the plants, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah. So I'm curious if you would tell us a little bit more about what that apprenticeship was like. I mean, I've had other people on the podcast who have gone through apprenticeships, and it's always sort of an interesting process that people go through. And, you know, this is kind of a big issue in the sense of working with an indigenous medicine, not being an indigenous person. And, you know, I'm one of these people that I'm all for everyone in the sense of, you know, what works for you, and want to respect cultures, but also I don't necessarily believe that any culture owns anything in particular. And I know that that gets into questions of appropriation. So, you know, it's about how those relationships are established. And so I'm curious if you just tell us a little bit about that. And a 10-year apprenticeship, that's not a small apprenticeship. That's a good long time.
No, it felt like a couple lifetimes actually. And when I agreed to the apprenticeship, according to the Shipibo tradition, it's a minimum 7-year commitment. So when my teacher was like, if you want to do this, it's got to be your number one priority. And truthfully, Martin, like my marriage fell apart, like all kinds of things got sacrificed in the whole journey of agreeing to be a carrier. But worth every moment, of course, you know. But the interesting piece about the being a white woman pouring medicine in an indigenous tradition, the moment where it shifted for me in terms of really owning that, of course, I had a right to do that, is when my teacher's teacher, who is one of the first of the Shipibo tribe to train Westerners to do this work, he essentially said to me, better you than me, serving medicine to crazy Westerners, because it's a different kind of relationship with consciousness that we have than people who live their entire lives connected to the earth, never experience disconnection the way that we do. So when he planted that seed of like, oh yeah, of course, Westerners helping Westerners actually makes a lot more sense because we understand the psychosis that we're dealing with and feeling disconnected. So I agree with you. It's, I obviously don't adhere to the idea of those boundaries anymore either. But at the same time, I'm very aware who came before me. I'm very aware of honoring these traditions and then also claiming the right that, of course, I get to be a part of it too.
Yeah, well, I think that that's a very interesting point that your teacher made about it actually might be better for a Westerner to be serving Westerners. And I think that it's kind of an overlooked issue in a sense where, when people are raised within a culture and within a tradition, there is a certain amount of embeddedness that happens in terms of just the worldview, the practices, and that we Westerners, white people, whatever, that obviously Western culture is fairly diverse. It's not all white people, but it's been dominated by, people of Caucasian background. But we're coming from a very different life experience and a different sense of assumptions about the way reality works, about what consciousness is. We come up with our own neuroses. And so it's not exactly necessarily a good fit just to jump into someone else's culture. And sometimes that becomes sort of just a shifting of identities of, okay, well, I'm going to reject my culture and now I'm going to adopt all of this culture. But then that can become its own sort of pathology in a sense because it's ungrounded. It's not that embedded sense. It's something that's all adopted. And so having this idea of Westerners serving Westerners with these traditional medicines, that really seems to make a lot of sense.
It does. And in fact, when I went on the hunt to find a teacher, I had at that point sat with the Shipipo for, 2, 3 years and had reached this kind of plateau because I recognized that my shaman, who was incredible, just didn't understand what I mean. I'd been diagnosed bipolar. I was like really, really trying to figure out what was going on with my psychology. And he didn't have any reference points. He would just kind of pat my head and be like, wow, must be tough being in there. Yeah. And didn't get it. And so when I went to find a teacher, I wanted a Westerner who understood that kind of pain and yet carried an ancient tradition. And I got it in a guy from France who had lived in Brazil for 17 years and had once been a heroin addict. So I'm like, okay, this guy gets the separation syndrome, the
Yeah.
craziness of feeling like we're not a part of source. So I got exactly what I wanted, and yeah, and now I get to be that for other people. Like, yeah, I have an understanding of a tradition that is thousands of years old, but I'm also a girl who went through bulimia and alcoholism and bipolar diagnosis, etc. So it's nice that I can offer that and pay it forward.
Yeah. And just kind of going back to that point again of like in indigenous cultures, these are people that are really embedded within their natural environment. And as you say, have not experienced that sense of disconnection and even disassociation from reality. But if we look at like Western religious history, that's been the dominant theme is actually isolation from nature, this projection of God of as being completely transcendent or source is completely transcendent and that the material world is actually sinful and bad. And we even see that in Eastern religious traditions of meditation traditions that say, well, all of reality is actually just an illusion and you want to get out of this thing. And then we go to indigenous cultures that are like, it's all right here. What are you even talking about? Like, I can see how that it just doesn't connect that idea of what do you mean you're disassociated from reality or that you're looking for God somewhere out there? Isn't all of this like right here?
Exactly. There's no context for that real experience that we have, even though, in a sense, those of us that are on the non-dual kind of train, we understand it's an illusion. It's still an experience we're having that feels very real. And to deny that is part of the disassociation. But to have somebody that's in a healing capacity, I think it's important that they at least have some sense of knowing what that trauma feels like. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be a completely shared trauma, but enough that there's a level of safety and familiarity. Otherwise, I don't feel safe enough to surrender myself in containers where I feel like I'm the weirdo, that I'm not understood. Once I found a Westerner that's like, I get you, girl, man, I could just let go and like finally experience some deep healing.
Yeah. So I am curious if since you mentioned it, I'll circle back around to it. But you don't, it's up to you what you would want to share. But you did mention that your marriage fell apart through this process, and this is one of the interesting aspects, and maybe it's not really talked about a lot in medicine circles, especially when people are talking about healing and kind of integration and coming into themselves. But I do see that often relationships do dissolve when one part of a partnership is going in pursuit of knowledge and healing, and maybe the other one isn't, that it can become an area of discord where life paths then diverge. Like I've written about that, I say, look, psychedelic healing is not necessarily couples therapy because sometimes you come to the realization like, oh, we've actually been in this relationship because we're holding on to something that isn't really there. And so sometimes that confrontation of healing truth actually takes people out of relationship. So I'm curious if there's anything about that process you'd be interested to share with us.
Yeah, my situation was really interesting in that my ex husband, who I still adore, there's no bad blood there, very much obsessed and in love with consciousness and this pursuit of expansion. So I thought, this is the perfect union. I can be in the plant medicine space and continue my evolution and not feel like there's this kind of separation happening. But the difference came in he's just one of those people that mentally adores the ideas of
Mm,
these things, but can't embody it. And it became a situation where I found myself taking full responsibility for all the shadows in the relationship because somebody had to. And I finally got fed up. He talked the best game of anyone I've ever met, but couldn't actually walk the walk. And that became an issue, not only in the marriage, but also in the shamanic apprenticeship. It was showing up in my ayahuasca spaces that I was just basically out of integrity, that I was, owning all of the shadow that wasn't mine. And I finally had to just call that out and say, all right, in order for even the ayahuasca space for me to feel truthful, I got to leave. And it was super hard, but never looked back, to be honest.
yeah. So I'm really curious if there's more you could share about this idea of embodying this. That I think that this is such an important distinction. And you offer coaching and consultations. I do as well. And this is something that comes up so often. I mean, it almost surprises me how much it comes up where people come to me and they're grappling with ideas, and it's like they want to pin things down in their mind. And then I usually come back to them with, okay, so how are you embodying this? And it's like it's a blank slate. Like it's even like, well, what do you mean? Isn't it about figuring stuff out? So kind of like you were saying, that there is the mental apprehension of ideas and the ability to repeat the terms, the phrases, but embodiment, I think, is a very different issue. So tell us what that means for you as an embodied
Oh,
woman.
what a beautiful question. Well, the first thing I want to bring in is this awareness that just because we intellectually understand something doesn't mean that we're walking in that truth.
Yeah.
And even that for me is a percentage game. Sometimes I'm 50% embodied and walking in the truth of something. And the first step of embodiment is actually acknowledging that it isn't fully integrated, to be like, wow, I understand this principle really well, but I'm getting triggered all the time. Let's say victim consciousness as an
Mm-hmm.
example. I understand that nobody's a victim, but goddamn, do I feel like one right now? Like, to just acknowledge that and to work with it, where a lot of us will just try to mentally push away what the body or the emotions are telling us because we, quote, know better.
Yeah.
You know, that's when we know we're not embodying things. And life shows us that all the time by what triggers us, what disrupts our way of being, anger, sadness, anything. We can see, I haven't embodied my spiritual wisdom around that because things are getting muddy. And the other thing, and I know you do this in your coaching too, is to like celebrate that information, not to shame ourselves for like, oh, great, I'm not in Christ consciousness. I'm not a master yet. Okay, that's all right. We got all the time in the world to figure that out. But most of us have shame around the fact that we get something, but we're not doing it right, so to speak. And ayahuasca has taught me to do this, to celebrate the awareness of, okay, cool, you got work to do there. That's okay. And then we can figure out what the roadmap looks like, in a very personalized way for embodying whatever truth that we're trying to actually walk in.
Yeah. And I think that's such a good way of looking at it. This idea that how you are reacting and how you are feeling and paying attention to that, and not just living in your ideals of, well, I should be happy all the time, or I shouldn't be getting angry. And so I'm going to avoid that or deny that I'm actually feeling that. Versus I like to say, well, this is just our diagnostic, right? So there's not shame, there's not guilt, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, if it's something that you want to shift, and if you don't want to feel those things, then then we can deal with this question of, well, how are you embodying yourself? How are you allowing yourself to feel what you're feeling and express that? And it's not about having the right thoughts or the right ideas. Those can help because, the mind is a messy place and it can be useful to have nice, clear concepts. But it is that no matter what, we're always going to be living in our bodies until we're not. but we got to deal with this thing. So how we do that is such an integral part. And I think being able to look at our reactions and our difficulties, again, the things that we feel, right? Because those are in the body. You're feeling it in the body. That helps us diagnose ourselves, helps us understand ourselves. It's not anything to be ashamed of or to have judgment around. It gives us the information like, oh, I'm feeling something about this. Let's investigate that further. And then is there a way for me to embody myself and express myself in a way that allows me to be clearer and freer within my own body and hopefully within our mind as well, because we got to live with that thing too.
Boy, do we. It's lovely when they're aligned,
Yeah.
but it's not often the case. But to allow that to be something that's a space of celebration, that we have the awareness of it. That's what ayahuasca is always reflecting to me, is like, you're aware of it though. So you can either chastise yourself for essentially being human,
Yeah.
or celebrate the fact that you have the awareness of some misalignment and you can do something about it. That's kind of the heart of free will. We get to choose in any moment, right? That we're celebrating the information that we have about our consciousness, or we're chastising ourselves that we don't know something, or we've done something wrong, or whatever it is. Yeah. Celebration's more fun.
Yes, it certainly is. So I'm curious, is there anything that you would describe as you were really coming to integrate this understanding into yourself and into your life? Is there a way that you would describe that you felt different in your body, in yourself?
Oh, gosh. The first thing that comes in is when the sensations in my body are allowed to be valid. There's a acceptance where I'm really saying, okay, it's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel this. That spaciousness is heaven right there. It doesn't even have to shift. I'm a very mental person, or I was. And so just to have that balance of saying, okay, this is what it is. I'm totally okay with feeling this right now. That just shifted the relationship with all of my consciousness, because there was like a mental permission that said, it's all welcome. Whereas before there was a lot of that resistance, because having sat in so many entheogenic spaces, especially with Aya, it's just abundantly obvious the resistance to what is what creates the suffering, not the feeling itself, right? And yet we can't help ourselves. I mean, just because I know that doesn't mean I have that embodied completely. Oh, heck no, I resist all the time. But just to be aware of that and to witness it, and to even celebrate the resistance itself, to be like, well, okay, that's what it's going to be tonight. I'm going to resist like crazy. That's all right. It's just, that deep breath, that relaxation comes in, because there's no fighting with what is. It's like, I get to be human. It's a wonderful space of permission.
Yeah. And again, that sensation in the body, I think, is very different than a mental realization or the attachment to a concept, because it's actually something that you feel. It's very distinct. And it's like, oh, okay, I can just allow whatever is happening, even if elements of it might be uncomfortable, or if I don't understand it, I can still allow it. And for me, it usually translates into this sense of openness within the body. And one of the places I like to focus is on the heart. That for me, the true embodiment of all of this really means just living with an open heart. That I think that through our concepts and our attachments and our ideas, we spend a lot of time with, we open our heart and then it's like, ow, and then we close it, and then we open it, and then we close it, and then we get judgmental, and then we get doubt, and we get self-criticism, and then we pick that up from others, and so we close off more, and then we try opening it again, and no, it hurts, and so it's like this constant expansion, contraction, and that can be exhausting versus, oh, I'm just open and I'm available to what I am. As you say, there's a relaxation there, which ironically can also be coupled with a great amplification of energy at the same time, that I'm relaxed in this empowerment. And
duality is so fun that way, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. Because we're not fighting it anymore. And so it doesn't happen when we're trying to chase a feeling of empowerment. I remember sitting in ceremony once with Aya on a tile floor, and I don't remember what it was I was resisting. I was fighting something, but her metaphor was, darling, if you want the whole floor, you got to give up your tile. And that comes to me all the time when I'm in that fighting space of like, oh yeah, the whole floor comes when you give up the tile, right? Like, that's that spaciousness and that empowerment and relaxation at the same time because there's no more fight. Magic.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so was your, forgive me if I'm digging too much, but so was your husband at the time, was he not interested in drinking ayahuasca, or did he try it, or was this just you just ended up on a different trajectory with this?
We met because I was invited to speak about ayahuasca at some little function in Vegas. So he was very interested in it, but up until the point that his mind got obliterated in a particularly strong ceremony. And he tapped into like the inner child that was terrified. But when he
Mm,
came out of it, he was in denial that it ever happened. And it just showed me, and I say this with total love, that he wasn't ready to really feel the terror filled, angry, sad little boy in there in order to release it. He went right back up into the mental space and was like, that never happened,
yeah.
which meant to me that, the medicine was just going to have to crack that code even harder and it could be really, really messy. So I didn't feel like it was my job to force him to feel, nor did I want to stay in a space that was going to maintain just this mental understanding. So that was the friction that finally got me to say, I choose not so much the medicine, I choose my own integrity and healing. I want to embody things. I don't want to just understand them.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about, how psychedelic healing is not necessarily relationship therapy, at least in the sense that we tend to think of like it's going to make things better between us, but actually it sounds like what you were able to come to is a deep realization about yourself and what would most serve you. And then also ending or not even engaging in what might have become a form of codependency of you encouraging him, okay, go crack it further, but really kind of, I think this is so important in this kind of work, is honoring that everyone has got to choose for themselves, and that sometimes that means our paths are diverging here because you're choosing what is in integrity and what is authentic for you, and that ultimately your husband, he's not your responsibility and you're not his responsibility, that we're all our own responsibility. And so choosing that is deeply empowering, I think. And it's also nice to hear you say that, you still care for him. It's just the recognition that, look, we're on a different path. And I do think that kind of what we're describing here, personally, I've seen this more with men than with women. This kind of the the mentation of it, of I want to understand the ideas, and that once I get into the feeling realm, that really kind of freaks me out. So I'm going to go back into ideas. I think that women overall tend to be a bit more comfortable in the feeling and emotional side, but also they can get lost there as well. So it's not that anyone necessarily has it any easier based on their gender or sexuality, but there are, there are different tendencies that might tend to show up. So I have seen this more in men, and that could just be with the clients that come to me as well, that they're stuck in their ideas and I need somebody to help jolt me out of this. But it's just beautiful to be able to recognize that and to honor yourself, that is so fundamental to any kind of really progressive work, I think. In any healing form, is to honor yourself.
I would even add that if we're working with psychedelic medicines, we have a desire for self discovery. And so if we discover, let's say in the context of a relationship, that we're just not aligned anymore, and we decide to deny that, but yet we continue to take psychedelics for self discovery, I mean, that's just a major friction recipe for, a big old break. Because and I see this a lot in the coaching, is that people discover these truths,
Hmm.
but they don't want them to be true.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm no longer aligned with my spouse, or I got to leave my job, or whatever it is. And they just try to navigate their way around it rather than just owning it. And, it's like the band aid metaphor. Like, can I just rip this off one at a time and maybe just leave it half on? No, if you're doing the self discovery, at some point we just got to own it, or the internal turmoil is just awful.
Yeah. And then it really takes over.
Yeah.
And and that's where I think in the potential of psychedelic work, that's when it can really get messy. If people are not really owning up to what they're experiencing and what they're realizing, that then it becomes a really nebulous rabbit hole that people can go down in sort of propping up the illusions of their lives without really taking responsibility for them. And so that's where we can get into all kinds of spiritual bypassing. And I mean, this is not anything that's unique to psychedelic work, that this happens in many different areas of life. But I think there's such an opportunity there to really encounter yourself and really own it and transform what you can, and then learn how to live with what you can't, and come from that, come from that place of empowerment. And
I love that last part, living with what we can't yet, because the idea is not to just perfectly unfold and embody these things. It takes time. And I encounter things on the regular where I'm like, whew, I don't think I'm ready to own mastery in that point. That's okay. It's okay. We're not supposed to just have a light switch where suddenly we're in Christ consciousness. But I think the name of the game we're talking about here is just to be aware and own it. I am working on this thing. I'm not ready to leave the relationship, say, but not to play the denial game of, but the relationship is perfect when we know it's not, as an example. It's just to be honest with ourselves.
Yeah. And even there, I think that probably contemporary Westerners, again, are living in a very different reality from people who are raised in an integral indigenous culture, where pretty much everybody is your family and everyone, and you're in a small community and you're living in balance in your local ecological environment. Whereas, again, we are just highly displaced people trying to find our way through careers and identities in multicultural, multiracial, multi-traditional societies that we get to pick and choose what we want to believe or what we want to follow or what identity we're going to adopt. And, so we have a lot more options. In some ways, it just makes life so much more confusing to find, like, where is the clarity of who am I, what are my relationships, where am I, and how am I going to be in this? So having that Western background, I think, can greatly help. It's like when I'm doing coaching sessions, they're all Westerners in some form or another, even if they're in the Middle East or, wherever they are, that they're still coming from this kind of background that, people from the jungle aren't contacting me,
Me neither.
Yeah. So let's get into moving from apprenticeship then into serving. And actually, my dog is asking to go outside, so I'm just going to let her out. But we'll talk about that right when I get back in just a second.
Perfect.
Yeah, so moving into serving ayahuasca. Tell us a little bit about that and what that was like for you. And were you nervous?
Oh my God. Yes, but I didn't show it. There was a little 9-month precursor that happened before that. So I left the medicine world before I stepped out and started pouring on my own. And I thought it was for good because I got really disenchanted by the abuse that's happening in these spaces. My teacher fell from grace, which I fully own, giving him the pedestal that co-created that very stereotypical teacher and student horrible fallout sort of thing, right when the student's ready to step out on their own. But I was so hurt by the abuse of people, medicine, whatever, by even people that were indigenous, by the way, that you thought you were safe with because humans are humans, and when we're given this kind of authority, some of us don't have the maturity of what to do with that, right? But I had to leave the medicine world for a period of time, I know now, so that I could really have a more conscious relationship of those pedestals. Because when I stepped up and sat behind the altar, then people were giving me those pedestals.
Yeah.
And to know how to navigate that not that I have it down, completely by any means, but I had some really painful experiences with it. So I'm not prone to accepting the pedestals because I know where that goes. So I'm really grateful for that period of time because it allowed me to just feel much safer doing this work and not having any drama like I experienced as an apprentice. Yeah. So I went from just like pouring medicine just for a few people here and there to getting an invitation to work at Rhythmia and overnight serving 100 people in ceremony, which it's lovely to know that I have that capacity. I will never do it that way again because it's not safe when you don't even know everybody's name, let
Yeah.
alone their medical history, their intentions, you know? So, but that was a big, essentially ayahuasca boot camp that I went through, living at Rhythmia for a year, doing 4 ceremonies, up to 4 ceremonies a week. Yeah, almost overnight, literally. So that's how I got my boot camp training. And then I think I left about 5 years ago. I've been doing my own thing in much smaller containers, thank goodness. But yeah, very nervous setting out to begin with. Heck yeah. Still am, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a few different things I want to pick up on there. One is I just want to comment that this issue of teacher-student relationship, it's interesting how it really is, in some ways, it's a very problematic relationship. And it shows up, I mean, I experienced that in academia, that when I was getting my PhD, that my dissertation advisor completely turned on me. And I was like, what the hell is happening here? And then, you know, I learned then that actually this was a really common experience for people in graduate school, that everybody talks about that. And then you hear about this in the business world where people have a mentor. And then all of a sudden, as soon as someone is like reaching their point where, okay, maybe now it's time for them to spread their wings and fly, all of a sudden the relationship turns. And so these power dynamics that I don't think it's due to any one particular culture or gender or anything, that this is something it's rather universal in the human condition. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that it's out there, it happens, and hopefully we can all work better in that. And also other people that I've talked to about, their apprenticeships in the medicine world, that there's been a lot of similar stories. So you're not unique there. Though, of course, I'm sure your situation had its own unique qualities to it, so I don't want to like overgeneralize it. But I'm really curious to kind of dive in a little bit more into the question of group size, because this is such an interesting question that, in my somewhat limited experience with group psychedelic work, mostly my world has been one-on-one, private kind of work like that. But in my experience, the group work can get messy. Probably like the largest ceremony I was at a Santo Daime ceremony, and there were maybe like 300 people there, and even half the people were not even in the salao. They had to be seated outside, and it just, to me, the dynamics of that just felt like wow, this is really odd, and I'm not sure how productive this is for people. So I'm curious about this serving, up to 100 people at Rhythmia and then moving into your own space. How did you determine what really is the ideal group number, and what can be done to keep things from getting messy as they can be? And I've recently read some reports about things that were happening at Rhythmia, so I have a little bit of understanding. We don't necessarily need to get into all that unless you want to, but I have a little bit of understanding of at least some people's perceptions of what was happening there.
Yeah, that's a whole Pandora's box. Let's just say it's
Yeah.
a mess and leave it at that. But I learned a lot about what not to do by working there, which
Mm-hmm.
is extremely valuable. So incredibly grateful for that experience. But I mean, like I said, if I don't know everybody's name, if I don't know their medical history and what they're bringing to the experience, I can't even help, I can't guarantee safety, nor can I help co create whatever magical thing that they want just by holding an intention, not because I'm a wizard, but because, like, when we're, it's like the power of prayer. It's like when we're aware of what other people are working with, we can be a champion for that. And especially in the Shipibo tradition that I studied, we do doctoring, which is essentially one-on-one work in a group setting, sit and sing and reweave the energies. It's important for me to be able to know a bit about that person. So you can't do that with 100 people. 30 is my maximum, but only when I have a staff of like 4 or 5 people, like that we're all doing it together. So that 1 to 6 to 8, one staff per 6 to 8 participants is kind of my special sauce. Anything more than that, I just can't keep track of it. Nor do I want to hold a container that is that big because, like you said, it can get really messy. Which we kind of want it to with Aya. We want to
Yeah.
like have people pop it off. We want to go deep, but it's we're contagious with each other too in that space. So when you've got 100 people and one person goes into a really deep process, you could have 15 people in a really deep process just like that, and you better be equipped to handle that. So there's a lot of logistics to consider with the nuances of the medicine. I won't pour for anything more than 30. If I'm by myself, 10 to 15 maximum, but I usually have like people, like we're a tribe that do it together. So, but still 30 is my max because after that, my brain gets like tied in knots and I don't know who's who and I don't like that.
Yeah. And that's something that I've heard from participants in large group ceremonies is that sometimes they feel they don't know who's who. Like they don't know who actually is the assistant versus who is an enthusiastic participant who is stepping up into a role. And sometimes people say that, the person leading the ceremony wasn't really leading the ceremony. So then who was? And because it is, as you say, it can get very messy and that actually that's welcome, but it can be contagious, where energies move around the room. People are open. So things shift around and that can be very confusing for like someone who's a complete novice. Like, why am I feeling all this stuff as this person is screaming on the other side of the room? And so we do want someone who knows how to steer the ship, at least in some capacity, and is able to do that. And so that it really is a question, like, can you really do that with 100 people? I don't think so. Yeah.
It was like plugging holes in the Titanic, Martin. It was like, please don't let the ship go down. And even, we would maybe have 8 of us that were, maximum 8 that were on staff. But at Rhythmia, the only people that he allows into the ceremonies are volunteers. They don't have any psychology history. They don't have any awareness of how to hold a container energetically. And so half the time I was also taking care of the team in addition to the participants. So no, there was no holding a container. It was just like praying things didn't go horribly wrong, which is not the way I want to do things.
No. Well, that's, as you say, it becomes a negative example. And sometimes those are necessary to decide, okay, well, how do I really want to do it? What's the way that I can do it that I feel actually is most beneficial and is in integrity with what I want to actually do in serving other people? So when then did you create Plant Medicine People? So we can go ahead and talk about this now. So this is the website, plantmedicinepeople.com, but it's also a retreat center in Costa Rica. And I just looked up on the map where you are because I actually have a family vacation planned to Costa Rica for winter break this coming school year. But it looks like you're pretty far up in the mountains from where we're going to be. It's sort of in the Monteverde area, which I've been to once before.
It's so beautiful.
With those
Yeah.
great big purple hummingbirds. It's like so cool.
Oh man, the wildlife, the foliage, all of it is so beautiful. Yeah, so we launched Plant Medicine People last year. I mean, I had been doing retreats in Costa Rica, Peru, and whatnot, but so it's kind of an answer to the space is now brimming with companies that are jumping into the psychedelic sector.
Yeah.
But not a lot of talk is happening around the fact that these plants are sentient, conscious beings. So Plant Medicine People is unique, not wholly unique, but unique-ish in that the focus really is relationships with the plant spirits themselves. So it's not just working with entheogens, it's also I'm doing a master plant diet right now with Magnolia, which means I'm merging with the spirit of that plant to learn, to get downloads, to heal, so that's the focus is just helping people cultivate really meaningful, deep, profound relationships with plant spirits in a safe way, but consciously acknowledging that these beings are also conscious. The psychedelic space doesn't always give homage to that. So that's my passion in creating or co-creating that company.
Yeah. So then why Costa Rica?
Because it's legal, decriminalized,
Mm-hmm.
because it's accessible, because it's a little bit easier to feel like I want to go on an adventure in Costa Rica than it is in Peru. A lot of people are scared of Peru. Peru is hardcore jungle. Costa Rica is jungle light.
Yeah.
It's just and plus having lived there myself, I'm very familiar with the energy. Costa Rica is so welcoming. It's just so easy there, and I am deeply seeking that, especially because I'll share with you in recent times, earlier this year, the state of Colorado arrested me for this work
Mm.
and threatened me with 40 years of prison. And I spent several days in jail, and I'm still in the process of negotiating, which is not going to be 40 years, but still, I got a big wake up call that it is not safe here. Even with all the decriminalization, I think what's happening is medicine carriers like me that clearly don't want to be part of the system, no matter if it's legal or not, right? The system isn't going to say it's legal for everyone to do it, only those that are accredited within the system. Well, I'm not going to be that person. So Costa Rica allows me to be the person that I want to be, So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the way that things are developing here in the States is really kind of crazy. I mean, so here in Oregon, we have decriminalized most things, and that we've also voted on having psilocybin assisted therapy, or what's called psilocybin assisted services, because they don't want to necessarily call it therapy. But anyway, that was voted on, and it won. And now there's also provision in that counties and cities can choose to opt out of the psilocybin program if they want. So there are people here in Ashland who have been trying to position themselves to be able to open up a clinic, but it turns out that our county might actually vote against allowing it in our county, even though it's been legalized within the entire state. And then another really odd one that is maybe even more relevant for you is like here we did have the Santo Daime Church took the federal government to court to recognize their religious freedom to drink ayahuasca. But one of the provisions of the court case was that they not call it ayahuasca, they only call it daime, because ayahuasca is just a shamanic ritual and doesn't therefore deserve any religious freedom protections. And Santo Daime is a church, and daime is a sacrament. It's not ayahuasca, even though it's the same drink. And even there, the church couldn't even mention that there were Santo Daime churches anywhere other than in Oregon. So this was a federal court case that only applies to Oregon.
It's maddening.
Yeah. It's a mess.
Yeah, it's a total mess. And here I am in the midst of this case, and in Colorado, we just got approval to have on the ballot in the fall a decriminalization bill of our own. So, my case, at least in the specifics of it, might be the last of its kind to go through the system if that is voted on and approved in the fall. But it opens up, as you're saying, all these other complexities. People think that, it's decriminalized and everyone gets to do their thing. All these rules and regulations come in, and it's maddening. But at the same time, it's growing pains, isn't it? This is what evolution looks like. To be truthful, I'm kind of blown away, having discovered Aya almost 20 years ago, that we are where we are. We've come so far so quickly. Because if you would have told me back in the early days that it would be decriminalized in Oregon by now, I don't know that I would have believed it. So it's progress, but it's really messy.
Yeah. And it kind of then comes back around to the question of who really is qualified. So I know that that's something that you guys are offering, is these courses of learning not just ayahuasca, but working with other medicines, and then also the dietas, which is, part of the indigenous tradition, but it's also something different than working with ayahuasca. Like you mentioned, the dieta that you're doing with magnolia, that is something different. That's another aspect of it. And so this idea of training, and then some places are now offering certificates, and the question is, well, how authentic is this certificate, and who trained the trainers, and what are their qualifications? And so it is very messy. It's also very exciting, and I agree that I never imagined. I mean, when I first encountered cannabis when I was 15 years old, and I was like, oh, I've got to work to help legalize this. I never thought it would happen,
Right.
and then it did, and it was like, this is
You did it.
amazing. And now what? We're going to offer psilocybin services in Oregon? Really? Wow. So things are definitely moving along, and I think that there's a much greater awareness around this, and so the old stigmas, they're changing. The old biases, they're changing, but it's still a very uncertain time. And so it does sound like Costa Rica is kind of a nice place to be because it's not the same level of scrutiny that we have in the United States. And it's, I guess maybe the war on drugs never really took hold in Costa Rica the way that it did here, that really amplified all the propaganda and the fear mongering. But I've never spent too much time in Costa Rica, but it seems like there's a lot of people offering medicine in Costa Rica, so it must be a friendly place for it.
Yeah, there's a ton of it. Yeah. And it is a friendly place all around. Their Pura Vida, motto is very prominent. And so that's my only reason for really wanting to vector more towards Costa Rica. And full disclosure, I want to move there as soon as I have the freedom to do so. Right now, Colorado's got me stuck in the Rockies, but as soon as I have that spaciousness, I'm going to go and be where it's safe for me to be a shamanic practitioner, not just a psychedelic practitioner, but shamanic, and that I'm trained in a tradition, not by the system. And so I'll never be that, which is, I'm totally in favor of people that want to go down that route if that's what's in their integrity, but it's not in mine. But you can only play one way and be safe in the States. So it is what it is.
Yeah. Well, I'm very sorry to hear that you have these legal troubles in Colorado, and I certainly hope that it sorts out to the most advantageous for you for this, because,
for everyone.
Yeah.
My hope is that they don't do this to another medicine carrier in this way. And I know there's a bigger picture. And that as soon as they got the initiative on the ballot, it was like, wow, this is very interesting. The timing of all of it. I can't deny the synchronicity and the bigger picture that is unraveling. So yeah.
Yeah.
I'm honored to walk through the fire on behalf of the plants, but I'm not going to be a martyr. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to be the test case.
Somebody's got to.
Yeah, somebody's got to, but it's still hard, and just want to recognize that. So,
thank you.
With plant medicine people, obviously you're offering a lot there. So maybe just tell us a little bit more about what all the different aspects are that are available at plant medicine people, and how people get involved. Like you've mentioned, only working in groups of 30 people, and you want to know everyone. So, what's your process of getting to know people, and what are people coming for, and the different programs that are offered there?
So for the retreats, it starts with, you can't even sign up for a retreat. You got to fill out a questionnaire, because we just got to know that people have, they're physically and emotionally safe to do this work, at least by as best we can determine by a questionnaire, right? And then if that all looks good, then people have an initial conversation with one of us on the team, just to answer all the questions, but also for us to gauge, just to make sure that it feels like they're ready for a deep dive with the medicine. And by the way, just because somebody's not necessarily ready for a full cup doesn't mean they can't come and have these experiences with us, because I'm of the opinion that subtle experiences are really beautiful too. That it is not go big or go home. Like at Rhythmia, they had a motto, don't think, drink, which just kind of makes me crazy. Like, wait a second, don't I get to have a say in the experience that I'm co-creating with this medicine? Not that I need to control it. I realize there's a fine line.
Yeah.
But I work a lot with people who are really scared of the full throttle psychedelic experience. So I'm like, cool, come have a little bit. Ease in, develop some trust, get to know the energies of the space, learn to trust me or whoever's facilitating. And, maybe you can work your way up, maybe not. But just because it's not going to be a full dose experience doesn't mean it can't be profoundly healing and have amazing gifts and insights. So once we do the interview, then as long as both parties say, yeah, this sounds amazing, then the experiences that we do in retreats, most of them are like ayahuasca retreats, but also with Wachuma. I also work with San Pedro, because I love completing a big long retreat with a big old dose of cactus love, talk about that heart opening space. And I find that he helps to embody and integrate the cosmic experiences that are happening with Aya, and that we end up feeling like we're more embodied when we go back into the world. Because after a big old dose of Aya, sometimes I can't handle the world. It's too much of a contrast.
Yeah.
Wachuma has a way of making me like fall in love with even the darkness again. It's like, okay, the world is what it is, and that's okay. So no matter what we do in the retreat, sometimes it's really focused on Wachumas. Most of the time it's more Aya. We always end with cactus because of that integration, heart opening piece. So those are the in-person experiences. And then we also have, of course, coaching, but coaching, we have our non-dual coach too, people that come from whatever perspective, whether it's like they're working with psilocybin or they're working with particular medicine, maybe they're dealing with a particular trauma. We try to have somebody that can really hold good space and reflect whatever people are integrating. So we have a team of coaches. And then my passion is doing the master plant diets, which I can do from a distance too. Sometimes we do them in person, but I do them remotely for people to merge the plant consciousness with the individual, and then coaching all throughout the diet to help make sense of what's happening. Because it's in some ways more difficult to integrate something that isn't entheogenic because it's subtle.
Yeah.
Because we have to rely on our intuition more and know that that's valid. So we do all the things, in terms of plant consciousness.
Yeah, well, I'm really interested in this idea of topping off the ayahuasca retreat with Wachuma. That, this is something, kind of another issue that I've seen with a lot of retreat centers is where people, they go for big doses, they get kind of blown out, and then they leave, but they haven't been stabilized, they haven't been grounded. And it sounds like for you, Wachuma seems to be working in that capacity so that people aren't leaving destabilized or ungrounded, but more centered in their heart, more centered in their being. That, it's great to go out into the infinite and to see all the cosmic stuff, but there is a very special importance in really coming back down to earth, coming back down into our bodies and into our being, so that then we can go back into the world and not just dissociate from it even further.
Yeah, it can be so jarring. So we work with not only Wachuma, but also time. We always have time at the end of the retreat that doesn't involve drinking plant medicine, so that you get to kind of stabilize again. Because I was a part of so many retreats where, you're doing your final ceremony and the next day you're on an airplane. Like, that's a lot. It's just too much to try to readjust. And on the last day of our retreats, we usually do a cacao ceremony, because cacao is so earthy and grounding, and she's got a little psychotropic element, but very subtle and very heart opening. And that way, we can ease back into our bodies and have integration circles, like start talking through what's been happening, so it doesn't feel so immensely jarring going back into the world.
Yeah. And this, again, is another place where indigenous cultures are very different, where, if people have been living with these kind of practices their entire life since they were kids, and they're in the same environment, versus people who are, engaging in ayahuasca tourism, they're going into a completely different environment, going to a completely different culture. And then what becomes alienating for a lot of people is then when they get back home, and if they don't have a community of people who are familiar with these kinds of events and these kinds of medicines, then that in and of itself can be very isolating, because then they feel like, oh, I don't know who I can talk to about this or share. And I think it's, with things like ayahuasca, it's becoming much more common, that people can find other people to talk about, but, not always. So it can just be very disorienting, the whole jumping from one culture, one environment, and one whole set of metaphysics, and, that it's a lot. So again, having someone who comes from a Western background and then is focusing on this integration and then time, I think it just sounds like a good way to go. So I just want to applaud that.
Oh, thank you. That was from learning the hard way. When I started drinking and coming back from the jungle, I went into some really dark spaces because of exactly what you're describing, and had no one. Everyone thought I was the weird girl
Yeah.
going off to drink some weird plant brew. No one knew what ayahuasca was then. So I didn't have any support. There was no integration. The therapist I did have was great, but he had never worked with entheogens. He didn't know what to do with me either. So yeah, that alienation is really intense. And like you said, thankfully that's not as common anymore because there's so many people doing this work, which is awesome.
Yeah. So we really are at a tipping point, I think, where I think most therapists in all variety of fields and also most psychiatrists and psychologists that they're going to at least have some awareness around these plant medicines. And I think that's one of the positive aspects of sort of the clinical therapeutic approach, that it sort of gives people in those professions permission to learn about it, even if they're not going to try it themselves, so that it won't be, yeah, people are coming back from Peru and saying, whoa, I just got blown up by ayahuasca, and having their therapist say, well, what is that? That maybe they'll at least have some knowledge and be able to relate, so that this information, this knowledge is getting out there, and it really is changing people's perspectives. And so hopefully we can all integrate more and have safer, supportive context for all of this.
Oh, love that.
Yeah, and it really sounds like that's what you're focusing on creating at Plant Medicine People. So you said it's, oh, I think I need to let the dog in because now she's going to bark at people. But
No worries.
let me grab her. Hold
No
on.
problem.
Oh yeah, I wanted to talk about making the decision to open Plant Medicine People. I'm just kind of curious from sort of the practical side of finding a space, building a staff, putting it all together. That's a huge undertaking. I mean, it's one thing to show up and, okay, someone's providing a house and we have room and I'm going to serve some tea here, and then, someone else will help set something else up. But actually creating a space, creating structures, having programs, working with a staff, that's a huge commitment and probably also
Well,
very fulfilling. But
we sort of cheated in that we didn't create that from the ground up.
uh-huh.
We partnered with an existing retreat in called Kinkara in Costa Rica. That is essentially our partner. They do other retreats, not just with us. But it's interesting that you should mention this, Martin, because that's kind of our next thing. Is once I get grounded in Costa Rica, it is the prayer of the tribe to have our own space so that we don't have to travel with our altars and our musical instruments and our sacraments and all of these things, and have a grounded place where we can do it. However, everything that you just mentioned are all the reasons why I haven't done it yet, because I worked at Rhythmia in the beginning and watched, it's a massive undertaking, to do everything that you mentioned. So we'll see if that really becomes something I think is worth creating, because I feel like I need to have something different to offer, not just another retreat, not to say that what we're doing isn't magical, not at all, but like, does Costa Rica need another plant medicine retreat? I don't know, and if it was a space where I could envision people being able to stay in the aftermath for a period of time and integrate, like that there was multi functions for it, that gets me more excited than just another retreat for plant medicine, yoga, whatever events. So that's still percolating, but right now what we've done is just partner with a group that is already got all of that in place, and they're amazing, by the way. So we got really blessed in that union.
Yeah, well, it's nice to be able to find those connections, and just kind of brings up a question that maybe you have some thoughts on. Is, I'm curious, how do you personally avoid burnout with, I mean, there's so many threads and so many offerings and so many connections. How do you keep yourself full?
Well, the short answer is I don't avoid burnout entirely. That is part of my shadow, my journey. I had literally a nervous breakdown in the middle of my apprenticeship, and all I could remember saying is, something's got to give. Something's got to give. I'm like, yeah, hon, like too many yeses. So I do work with a lot of plants that teach me boundaries, because it hasn't been something inherent in me. I've had to really work hard to say the word no or
Mm,
not now.
yeah.
Um, self-care is no longer an option. It's a priority because I know like what it felt like to have that full scale burnout. So my mornings are always for me. I'm an early riser and I spend at least the first 2 hours of every day taking care of myself. Like I don't look at my phone, like no responsibilities. And I know you understand this. I've had to create a coaching practice around money and energy exchange because I did so much of it for free
Yeah.
because I love it and then burnt out as a result. And I'm always negotiable with money. It is not, it's more of an energy exchange so that like people also have to show up for it in some way too. But a lot of that has allowed me to have more spaciousness. I've actually scaled back how much coaching I'm doing so that I can also focus on plant medicine, people marketing, and all of that. But it's a perpetual balance that I have not even been close to perfecting, you know? So thank you for asking, keeping it in my field.
Yeah, well, it's nice to know that it's in your awareness because it is something that I see happen to people in this space because it's exciting. It's very exciting to be working with these medicines and with these plants. And it's exciting when we see profound openings and changes within people and see those heart openings and see the tears coming and seeing people find relief or meaning. And so it can be, there's a lot of pull to keep giving, to keep doing. But it's really beautiful to hear you say that you keep your mornings to yourself. And that also, I think this also is a very Western issue, is around money. And that there's people in the psychedelic world is like, well, all this should be for free. And how dare anyone charge? And it's like, well, we live in a monetary economy. How are we supposed to survive? And so that it can be an element of caring for yourself to actually charge money, and that because we do live in a monetary economy, that adds value for people, because sometimes people do just want to get stuff for free, and then there's like, well, it was free, so what does it matter, you know? But when you have
Yeah.
to pay for something, we tend to take it a little bit more seriously. And yeah, money's all an illusion, it's not real, but it's the game we're all playing. It's part of the rules of the game, and we can't really avoid it. And so it's always nice when people are actually taking care of themselves while they're also being in service. And that I would never want to promote that someone just give themselves away. And I've done that. And it sounds like you've done that. And it feels a lot better when actually you're honoring yourself, doesn't it?
Well, it also helps with imposter syndrome because then I know I'm not a hypocrite when I'm helping others to take care of themselves too,
Yeah.
right? It's like, ooh, that doesn't feel good when you're giving advice that you know you're not taking at all. And, you know, so I like being in integrity with that. It feels really good to have that credibility that I'm actually taking my own advice as best I can. Not that it's perfect yet.
Yeah. And that's always the great thing to recognize that, you know, when we go into full non-dual absorption, you know, that's the time when, okay, obviously everything is perfect. Obviously I can not worry. Obviously I can let go. But then when we get into the minutia of mundane existence, there's lots of things that are not perfect, you know, in the personal sense. And so being able to live with that and recognize that and do what we can to make things more perfect for ourselves and better, you know, that's what inspires us to move forward.
And it doesn't negate the wisdom of perfection by admitting that we feel something's imperfect,
Yeah.
right? They can both exist. It's like, I know everything's perfect. And yet, like, when I got arrested, that didn't feel perfect. It was
Yeah.
like, wow, this doesn't feel perfect. But I did feel like jail was the best place to get enlightened because that pressure cooker was so incredibly potent to give me a choice of whether to suffer or to believe in the bigger picture, you know? So, but it's okay. I could hold both. Wow, this sucks. And oh my God, I'm in on the cosmic joke. This is amazing. You
Yeah.
know, both were and still are true. And that's one of the gifts of psychedelics to me is like they allow us to be dual and non-dual at the same time and be like, this is what it is to be conscious in this way. Like amazing.
Yeah, I like to express it as sort of embracing the paradox that things can be both perfect and imperfect at the same time. Things can both be one and multiple at the same time. Something can be both yes and no at the same time. And that's where, going back to kind of where we started, if you're too locked into your ideas, that ideas tend to be binary. It's either this or it's that. But then if we can feel the perfection and the imperfection at the same time, we can realize, oh, my concepts can't really encapsulate the paradox of being. And that, for me as a non-dualist, it's like, yeah, there's only one being, but it doesn't mean that you aren't living a separate life from me, that we are different embodiments of the one being. And so we have different perspectives, different experiences, different thoughts. And so, yes, we are separate, but we're also one. It's not just one or the other. And that's also, again, where the embodiment is very important, because it's not just about ideas. It's not just about escape. It's actually also being here and being in and feeling, not just thinking, right? So we want to ideally balance all of these things within ourselves. And that is the everyday challenge, because it's not like, oh, I've found the perfect balance and I'm going to maintain it forever. Nothing's ever going to affect me. Like, I don't believe that.
Well, if that's the case, then I get a gold star for solving duality, and I'm out of here. So yeah, I know I've got a little bit more work to do on that regard.
Yeah. So when did you start your coaching?
About a decade ago. I started it officially because I've been doing it. So I was hosting ceremonies when I was apprenticing. And as the host and organizer, I was the first touch point for people. So it was very natural in the aftermath. I was helping them through whatever crazy experience they had. So it was about a decade ago. I was like, okay, I need to charge money for this, because the burnout had happened. So yeah, it's been quite a while. I had no idea it was going to become the new it career. I did not know that psychedelic integration coach was going to be the next thing, but here we are.
Yeah. And it's interesting how, even 5 years ago, the word integration is only recently really being used, this idea of integration, and it's still kind of nebulous for some people, like, what does that mean? But in I think just the loosest terms, it's like dealing with the aftermath of what happens when you go through a big experience. And then again, especially for people who are encountering these things that maybe are not necessarily culturally grounded, that have, a vocabulary or even, just a general understanding of what you went through. Again, like if you're growing up in the jungle and your tribe is your family and all the adults have drank ayahuasca their entire lives and you drink ayahuasca, and then you can talk to them about it and it's all very normal. But in our society, it's still not all that normal. And so this question of like, oh, what do I do with that? Or what does that mean? And I want to change my life, but I don't know how, that these are big questions for people that are coming from a very different context. And so having people that can help guide them through is just so valuable. And yeah, it's a hot commodity these days because people need it. People need integration.
Deeply. And because there's so much of this work happening, yeah, people need people that get the process of embodying, or at least have a roadmap to work with. I don't have the answers when people come to me for coaching. I don't know. The more I do this work, by the way, the more I give myself the permission to say, I don't know. Let's try to figure it out. And that's what a coach is. We're partners in this. We're not like sages. We're not gurus. We're like, okay, what happened? What do you want to do with it? Let's figure out how to get there. And yeah, it's the coolest gig in town as far as I'm concerned. I feel incredibly blessed that this is how I spend my days.
Yeah. So in the 10 years that you've been doing this, have you found or noticed any particular shifts in either issues or in clientele? Have you seen things change over that time period?
Yeah. In the beginning, a lot more instability, I would say, of just people, because there wasn't information out there. There wasn't a lot of foundation for people to even know how to prepare, let alone integrate. These days, I encounter a lot of what ayahuasca calls people doing their homework on the teacher's desk, meaning using ceremony as a space of integration, as an only space where they're doing any sort of shadow exploration because it's available so often now. So that was not the case a handful of years ago, where I felt like people were escaping in psychedelics themselves, and now that's a real thing. And it's so interesting that you could do that with something as potent as Aya and whatnot, but you totally can. Like our minds are so powerful to disassociate and escape. It doesn't matter what it is that we're doing. So I see that a lot more frequently now. And then the fact that I mean, I've poured medicine for like an 80-something-year-old grandmother that never even drank alcohol
Yeah.
and is called to Aya. God, it makes me so excited that people feel the call to do this work, even if they weren't lifelong psychonauts, that they just feel like it's time to know something beyond what, their consciousness has shown them to that point. That blows my mind. That I have a chapter in my books that's called "Everybody That Your Grandma Wants to Do Psychedelics," because that's what's happening now, and it makes me really happy.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest shifts that, because even you described yourself in starting out your apprenticeship that you said you were already a psychonaut, so you were already kind of interested in sort of this area. But this is, I think, where we see one of the biggest changes that we, like you say, we're getting people who are maybe in their older years that are saying, I think maybe this is for me. And they'd never considered it their entire lives. So that there is a completely different demographic that is now becoming involved that formerly, is just hippies and new agers and, people who are into this stuff already. But now, we're getting grandmas and we're getting the, people who have just never been involved in this world. Are a lot of them, they read like Michael Pollan's book and like, oh, I've never heard of these things before. And, oh, the food guy told me about it, so I'm so interested. But that's definitely a very different demographic than what had been out there before.
Oh, totally. And to get people that are from parts of society that is still shunning this use. Like I've had police chiefs and government officials and people like that are like, I have to do this, but no one can know. It's to even be willing to take that risk says a lot about how profound the calling is for so many people to say, I want what I've been witnessing other people having, which is, just more light, more awareness, more heart. So it just kind of blows my mind of how ayahuasca in particular, because she's messy, she's difficult. Like it is not fun times on drugs. It is not. And yet people show up again and again, actually, to do this work. And I would not have seen that coming. And yet it's really beautiful, really affirming.
Yeah. And just to touch on a point that you made previously, about how there can be sort of the spiritual bypassing that has taken place in all different forms of spirituality and also in with psychedelics and versus integration, confronting the shadow, really acknowledging these things. Oh man, I had something I was going to say, but now it's like, what was the point? Oh, it just drifted away. It drifted away.
It does that.
Sorry.
No, no worries. That happens to me all the time.
What was I going to say? I don't know. Maybe it'll come back to me, but it was something about that. Gosh, it's on the tip of my tongue, but it's gone now. Anyway, let's maybe it'll come back to me in a moment as I listen to you answer the next question. Maybe it'll return. But yeah, I did want to ask you about your book and the writing of your book. And you're someone that I'm interviewing that I've not seen the book. And when I was going through your material earlier today, I was like, oh, wait, no, she's written a book and I haven't seen the book. Oh, no. But yeah, tell me about your book.
Yeah, the book is called Plant Medicine Mystery School. It's volume one. There are multiple volumes that are looming around me, but the volume one, the subtitle is The Superhero Healing Powers of Psychotropic Plants. So it furthers this mission I have of exposing the plants as sentient beings. Basically, I break down the major entheogens into archetypes, like the astrological vibration that they work with, the tarot cards, all of their personality traits, their challenges, their gifts. Just treating them as beings instead of objects, and then a lot of information, just like we're talking about, it's like a psychonaut's guide to safe and ethical sourcing and journeying from the perspective of someone who's trained in a shamanic tradition. So that's the book.
Yeah, where did you write it?
I mean, I started writing it. Well, first of all, full context. I have an English degree, and the first ceremony I ever had with Aya, she was just throwing books at me, and they had my name as the author. I'm like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to do this thing. But I was disenchanted by the publishing world, as most of us are, and So eventually I finally downloaded it, started bringing it in over the course of about a year and a half, 2 years. I got a book deal with one of the big publishing houses, and at the 11th hour, they were like, well, but you've got to change this and that, and basically things that I wasn't comfortable with. So I didn't sign the contract.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I was going to have to just sort of give up the dream or self-publish, which is a lot of work, as you know. And I'm like, okay, I'm willing to do that. But then I met a contemporary of yours, maybe you know him, Richard Doyle, who's also been writing non-dual perspective plant medicine books for a long time. Darwin's Pharmacy is one of his. And he started a little publishing operation called Metanoia some time ago for the same reasons that most of us are disenchanted with that space, and was willing to publish it. So I found help. I needed help, or I was going to burn out. And we just published it like 6 months ago. Yeah.
Oh, great. Great.
Yeah.
Well, if you ever wanted to send a copy my way, I'd be interested to take a look at
will.
that. And you know what?
I would love to.
It worked. I remembered what I wanted to say. And the point that I was trying to get around to with the spiritual bypassing and avoiding the shadow and things like that is one of the things that I like to emphasize working with plant medicines is that even though we are subjected to a lot when we choose to consume these things, in my experience, they can never violate your free will. So if you choose to ignore or avoid something, it might be very uncomfortable, but you can do that. And if you choose to explore it, you can do that. And if you choose to resist, you can do that. If you choose to surrender, you can do that as well. So I always like to emphasize that it's not going to violate your free will because it's ultimately an amplification of everything that you are. And so, yeah, that's when people say, well, how could people take these medicines and then not confront their shadow? It's like, well, because it's their choice.
They don't want to. It's
Yeah.
that simple.
Yeah.
Yes. They don't force their way in. I like to describe with Aya in particular, she just needs a little crack in the door and then she'll come busting in. But if you have the door locked and closed, she'll respect that. There's no violation of free will. Like you said, it's like we gotta have some desire to want to know something different.
Yeah.
I know from my personal experience, if I said no, I can't deal with that right now. Oh, cool. All right. Yeah, the resistance sucks. The denial of it is painful, but there's no forced entry in that way. So it's very possible for people to work with them their whole lives and not do shadow work if they don't want to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting that it opens up so much, yet choice is always there. And I think that's such an important lesson for all aspects of life because there's so much that's quote unquote out of our control, but there's still always choice in every moment. So it always does come back to how am I choosing to choose how I'm going to respond to whatever it is that's happening in my life on a moment-to-moment basis, whether it's really easy or really difficult or really pleasant or really unpleasant. There's always choice.
It's one of the most compassionate aspects of consciousness, isn't it? That we do get to choose, that's never taken from us. I've worked with that so much with Aya, where she'll say, what's your worst case scenario? And I'll think of something like being kidnapped by terrorists, it's like, they can't take away your power to choose either. There's a state of consciousness available where you're like, I say yes to this. Cool, it's happening. And that's why we call it liberation. It's like so incredible that exists in consciousness, that we get to say yes or no, or how we're going to relate to what's happening, no matter what it is. It's incredible.
Yeah. And really accepting that becomes empowering, I think, and allows you to move through this stuff that is difficult and is hard, and finding, well, where is my choice in this? And then
one of my favorite things to say to myself is, well, this is happening. Huh. Because it acknowledges it. If I'm in the throes of some crazy psychedelic experience and like brain in a blender, I'm like, well, this is happening. All right. Because there's some levity in that, and I acknowledge it. It's a spirit of acceptance, and then I get to choose what to do with it from there. Like, do I want to fight it? That's fine. That's available. Do I want to lay back and surrender and like go on a cosmic journey? Cool, But I love that power of choosing how to relate to what is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, great. Well, Kat, it's been great speaking with you today. I do need to wrap it up because I'm choosing to go to the dentist next. Well,
Brave choice.
I am choosing to honor the appointment that was made.
I support you in that. Thank you for having me. This conversation was wonderful. And you are an inspiration. Thank you for all you do.
Oh, well, thank you for saying so, Kat. And just to remind the listeners, we have plantmedicinepeople.com, and that's where you can find out about the courses, about the retreats, about the diets, and going out to Costa Rica. And then if you're looking for more individual coaching, then you can find Kat at afterlife.coach. And all kinds of information available there. And your book is, what's the title of the book again, and where is it available? Everywhere?
It's on Amazon. Plant Medicine Mystery School is what it's called.
Plant
Thank you.
Okay, it's a great name. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today, Kat. Thank you so much for connecting and sharing your time with us.
Thank you for having me, Martin.